I woke up to an eerie silence. No gentle splashing, no rhythmic hum of the pool filter, no shimmering reflections dancing across my ceiling. Just an absence, an unsettling, unnatural quiet. Something was wrong. I threw on my slippers and rushed outside, only to be met with a sight so ridiculous, so completely absurd, that for a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was still asleep. My pool, my large, pristine, professionally maintained backyard pool, was empty, bone dry. The once inviting oasis was now a barren pit, a lifeless hole in the middle of my yard. And standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, faces smug, was the HOA board. Leading them, of course, was Karen McIntyre, the reigning queen of unnecessary rules and micromanagement. Clipboard in hand, that ever-present smirk plastered across her face, she called out with fake politeness that made my skin crawl. "Good morning, Noah." Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone you'd use with a misbehaving child. "I see you've noticed our little adjustment." Adjustment? My brain struggled to process the sheer insanity of what I was looking at. "Karen," I said slowly, my voice dangerously even. "What the hell happened to my pool?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, as if I was the unreasonable one here. "The HOA board voted unanimously to drain it," she said, gesturing toward my mailbox. A bright yellow envelope stuck out, like a glaring insult. I ripped it open, scanning the text inside. HOA violation hashtag 237B. Unauthorized water waste. Fine, $2,500. I let out a hollow laugh, reading it again, as if the words might suddenly start making sense. You actually drained my pool? Without my permission?" Karen's smirk widened. "It's not about permission, Noah. It's about responsibility," she chirped. "We're in a drought." I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Drought? I gestured wildly toward the immaculate, HOA-mandated golf course down the road, its sprinklers still gleefully dousing the grass. "The city hasn't declared a drought." "Well," she sniffed, adjusting her clipboard, "the HOA has. We must set an example." I took a slow, deep breath, willing myself not to say something that would land me in legal trouble. "You drained my pool," I said, my voice dangerously low. "For wasting water. The water I pay for. In a neighborhood that burns through more irrigation for decorative flower beds than an entire city block." She nodded, utterly unfazed. "That's correct." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth hurt. "And if I refuse to pay this ridiculous fine?" Karen's eyes practically sparkled with anticipation. "Then we put a lien on your house, of course." That was it. The sheer, unchecked audacity of these people was something I had only heard about in HOA horror stories. But draining an entire pool? This wasn't just overreach. This was a power play. I took a slow step forward, locking eyes with Karen. "You know, Karen," I said, my voice deceptively calm, "I don't think you quite understand who you're messing with." She scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, Noah, don't be dramatic. Rules are rules." A slow, humorless chuckle escaped me. Not the kind of laugh that signaled amusement, the kind that sent a warning. Because Karen had no idea. I took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of satisfaction rise above my fury. "Let me ask you something, Karen." I folded my arms, tilting my head slightly. "Where do you think this neighborhood's water comes from?" For the first time, her smug expression faltered. "The city, obviously," she said, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Wrong." Her frown deepened. "What?" I took my time, savoring the moment. 20 years ago, when this neighborhood was being developed, the original landowners didn't sell the water rights to the city. I let that sink in. They sold them to a private investor. Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard. "What does that have to do with anything?" I leaned in just slightly. "That private investor was me." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then let out a forced, brittle laugh. "That's ridiculous." I shrugged. "Is it?" Her hands clenched. "You're lying." "Am I?" For the first time since I'd met her, Karen actually looked uncertain. I could see it, The moment she realized she had absolutely no idea what the fine print in her own rulebook actually said. And so, because I'm nothing if not a generous man, I decided to twist the knife just a little deeper. You know that emergency water conservation fee you're about to impose on homeowners? I asked, feigning curiosity. It would be a shame if there wasn't any water to conserve. Karen's face drained of color. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice to a hushed murmur. You just picked a fight with the one person who controls every single drop of water in this neighborhood. Karen instinctively took a step back, clearly scrambling to regain her composure. You can't just shut off the water. I smiled again, slow and deliberate. Can't I? Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. With exaggerated sympathy, I clapped a hand on her shoulder. Oh, Karen, you really should have read the fine print. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, speechless, rattled, and for the first time in her life, utterly powerless. Because by tomorrow morning, this entire neighborhood was going to learn exactly what it meant to play by HOA rules. And Karen? She was about to learn what it meant to play by mine. The next morning, I sat on my porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching as the neighborhood slowly stirred awake. It was a picturesque scene. Birds chirping, joggers making their early rounds, the rhythmic spray of sprinklers keeping pristine lawns lush and green. Even the HOA's prized golf course, somehow exempt from their so-called drought restrictions, gleamed under the morning sun. It was almost a shame that everything was about to change. Almost. I took one last sip, pulled out my phone, and made a single call. It didn't take long for the chaos to start. At first, it was just a slight drop in water pressure. Sprinklers began sputtering instead of spraying, and a few hoses slowed to a pathetic trickle. But as the minutes ticked by, the full effect set in. Faucets ran dry. A woman in her front yard stared in disbelief as her garden hose hissed out nothing but air. Confused murmurs turned to frustrated voices. Then came the shouting. Karen, still in her bathrobe, stormed out of her house, phone glued to her ear, barking into it as she stomped toward the HOA office. Other board members joined her, looking just as bewildered. From my porch, I sipped my coffee and watched. Karen's usual smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by pure frustration. That's when things really started to unravel. Neighbors began knocking on doors, trying to figure out what was happening. A man in workout gear twisted his kitchen faucet and let out a string of curses when nothing came out. A woman stared at her half-filled bathtub, like it was the last water supply on Earth. And then, oh, the best part, the sprinklers on the HOA's beloved golf course shut off mid-cycle. The decorative fountain at the community center gurgled once, twice, and then fell silent. Karen's shrill voice cut through the air, her usually syrupy tone now an outright bark as she issued frantic orders to her fellow board members. But they just looked helpless. She waved her phone like she could threaten the water back into existence. I knew exactly what she was doing, calling the city. That was going to be a fun conversation. I stretched, stood up, and casually strolled down the street, blending into the growing crowd of confused residents gathering outside the HOA office. Karen stood on the front steps, trying to calm everyone down. Please, everyone, stay patient. We're looking into the issue, and I assure you we will have the water restored as soon as possible. Skeptical murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman in a robe folded her arms. Oh, so now it's an issue? I thought the HOA was all about water conservation. Karen's eye twitched, but she forced a tight smile. Yes, and conservation is important. But this is an unexpected infrastructure failure. I almost pitted her. Almost. Karen spotted me in the crowd, and her face contorted in barely concealed rage. Noah, she snapped, her voice tight. Do you know anything about this? I let the question hang for a second, then shrugged. Me? Oh, I don't know, Karen. I thought the HOA was supposed to manage all of our water needs. Isn't that why you drain my pool? To teach us about responsibility. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. People were connecting the dots. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I tilted my head. Enjoying the fact that my neighbors don't have running water? No, Karen, that sounds awful. But I do find it fascinating how quickly the HOA starts panicking when you lose control. Her glare could have melted glass. She turned to one of the board members. "Get the city on the phone. Now." The man nodded and dialed. I watched as his hopeful expression quickly faded, his face paling as he lowered the phone. He swallowed hard. "Karen, the city says they don't control our water." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard. "That's ridiculous." "Of course they do." I smiled. "No, Karen, they don't." The crowd went dead silent. The realization hit her like a freight train. I let the moment stretch before stepping forward, hands in my pockets. See, years ago, when this neighborhood was being built, the city never actually purchased the water rights. They just assumed they'd have access when the time came. Karen's face twisted in confusion. "What does that have to do with anything?" I shrugged. "Well, the developers had a different plan." I leaned in slightly, dropping my voice just enough for her alone to hear. "They sold the water rights to a private investor." Her brows furrowed. "Who?" I gave her the slowest, most satisfied grin of my life. "Me." It took a second for it to register. And then panic. Her face paled, her lips parted, but no words came out. I clapped her shoulder once, mock sympathy dripping from my voice. "Oh, Karen, you really should have read the contract." Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, utterly wrecked. Because tomorrow, this neighborhood was going to find out exactly what it meant to be at the mercy of HOA rules. And Karen? She was about to find out what it meant to be at the mercy of me. Karen looked like she wanted to strangle me. Her eyes narrowed as she pieced it together, and I gave her a slow nod, confirming her suspicions. "They sold the rights to a private party," I said, tapping my chest. "That party was me." A hush fell over the crowd. Somewhere, someone gasped. "You're bluffing," Karen hissed, her face twisting with disbelief. I shrugged, calm as ever. "Check the paperwork. It's all public record. I own the rights to every single gallon that flows into this neighborhood. The city never bought them back, and the HOA? They never even realized the water supply wasn't under municipal control." Karen's confidence began to crack. I could see it in her posture, the weight of the situation finally landing. "So," I continued, "when you drained my pool and slapped us with those ridiculous water penalties, you were enforcing rules on something you didn't own." Her fists balled at her sides. "You can't cut off everyone's water." I tilted my head, grinning. "Who's going to stop me?" The crowd stirred, nervous murmurs growing louder. The HOA had always pushed boundaries, but this was full exposure. The curtain had dropped. Karen glanced around, clearly realizing she was losing control. "Fine," she snapped. "You made your point. Turn it back on." I clicked my tongue. It's not that simple anymore. This is a business now. And given the way the HOA's been handling things, let's just say the old rates don't apply. Her face flushed a deeper red. "You're blackmailing the neighborhood." "No," I said. "I'm offering them freedom. They can keep paying the HOA for nothing, or they can deal with me directly for fair, honest prices." Years of pent-up frustration burst open. I didn't even have to convince anyone. An older man, quiet and steady, broke the silence. "I'm done with the HOA. I'll get my water from Noah." Another voice, "Count me in." Then another, and another. Karen's eyes widened as her grip slipped. It wasn't about water anymore. This was about power, and hers was evaporating. Her face contorted with rage. She tried to hold her usual poise, but it was all crumbling. The same people who once tiptoed around her were standing taller now, looking at her with disdain and maybe even pity. She straightened her clipboard like it meant something and whispered to the board behind her, "This isn't over," before marching back inside the HOA office. The board members hesitated, unsure, then followed her in with worried glances. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I already knew what was coming next. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She'd scramble for a loophole, a way to claw back control. But there wasn't one. I held the legal rights, airtight and irrefutable. Even a court wouldn't help her. That afternoon, I got a formal email from the HOA's account. An emergency measure to stabilize the neighborhood's water supply. Sounded serious, until you realized it was just a smokescreen. Karen was preparing a desperate move. That night, I sat on my porch and watched a few board members sneaking around, whispering like teenagers past curfew. Maybe they thought they could outmaneuver me. Call in favors. Cut a backroom deal. It didn't matter, because while they were plotting, something bigger was happening. The neighborhood was waking up. The next morning, a larger crowd gathered, not in protest, but in fury. People weren't just angry about water. They were furious about the years of petty fines, absurd restrictions, and money disappearing into HOA black holes. Karen stepped out looking like she hadn't slept. Still trying to command a room, she assured everyone the city was stepping in, that the water would return. No one believed her anymore. Then the vote started. Every HOA has a clause that allows for a vote of no confidence. It's rarely invoked, usually because no one thinks it'll change anything. But this time it did. I didn't have to rally them. They rallied themselves. Karen fought back. Emergency meetings, threatening emails, desperate phone calls, but it was too late. By the end of the week, it was official. The HOA had been dissolved. And just like that, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. People opened champagne in their driveways. The golf course, once the HOA's pride, was left dry and forgotten. The community center became just another empty building. And Karen? She was the last one left. I saw her standing alone outside the office, staring at the vacant parking lot. The realization had hit. She was no longer in charge. The title, the authority, the overinflated salary, it was all gone. She spotted me watching and walked over, slower than usual. For once, she didn't march. She just moved. "You planned this," she said quietly. I sipped my drink. "You brought it on yourself." She let out a bitter chuckle. "You think you're a hero? That things will be better without the HOA?" I shrugged. I think people deserve to live without being controlled by someone addicted to power. She sighed and looked down. "So what now?" I smiled. "Now, you live like the rest of us. No clipboard, no fines, just another homeowner paying for your own water." She gave me a long look, something between hatred and resignation, then turned and walked away. A few days later, a moving truck pulled up in front of her house. Nobody was shocked. Karen wasn't the type to stick around after the crown slipped from her head. I raised my glass from beside my freshly refilled pool and watched the truck drive off. And with it, the last piece of her reign disappeared. Peace at last had returned. Thank you for watching this story until the end. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share, and subscribe for more HOA Untold Realities.